Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Canadian context. Despite intense public scrutiny and opposition from many in civil society and several First Nations, output from the Canadian oil sands has grown to roughly 3.5 million barrels per day. And the oil sands are not done growing. They are expected to account for the majority of the 500,000 barrels per day of Canadian oil production growth by end of this year. What does a world using less oil, if that indeed happens, mean for the oil sands? In November 2023, the International Energy Agency said, and I quote, "Many producers say they will be the ones to keep producing throughout transitions and beyond. They cannot all be right." Well, we've heard exactly that from top executives of oil sands producing companies, that their barrels should be and will be the last ones ever consumed as the world transitions away from oil. Are they right? And are the reports of the death of the oil sands greatly exaggerated? To help us explore that question and others, we invited Dr. Andrew Leach to join us on the show. Andrew is an economist with the University of Alberta's Department of Economics and its Faculty of Law. His research spans energy and environmental economics with a particular interest in climate change policies. His most recent book is Between Doom and Denial, Facing Facts About Climate Change. In 2015, Andrew served as the chair of the Government of Alberta's Climate Leadership Panel. I personally got to know Andrew when he invited me to give a talk to his business school class in 2011, after which we in the class went to the pub to have a discussion, not unlike the one we had on the pod. Here's the show. So, Andrew, can we put the present role today of the oil sands into context? How important are the oil sands to the Albertan and Canadian economies in terms of jobs, GDP, taxes, royalty, lease payments, all of those goodies?
Yeah, so oil sands, as you said in the opener, they're the lion's share of Canadian oil and gas production in terms of whether it's GDP, exports, resource revenues, et cetera. They're all the vast majority of any of those categories. And if you add all of that together, it's about 10% of Canadian GDP, depending on how you calculate it, what you put in the bucket, what you don't. Split that out across the provinces. It doesn't spread evenly. Alberta and Saskatchewan and BC have a much larger share, Newfoundland and Labrador. Alberta's share among those is probably 5 to 10 times as high as any other province. And, 10 times higher than any of the non-energy producing provinces, should be kind of obvious. But jobs wise, it's, 300,000-ish workers, depending again on who you count as an oil and gas worker and who you don't. If you use the same definition you use for green jobs attached to solar, then we're probably adding, 400,000 to 600,000 indirect and induced jobs on top of that. So it's a massive sector and a massive impact on the economy. A third of our exports right now are our energy, 30% oil and gas. So it's a massive part of our economy, no matter how you qualify it. And then, we just came out of Alberta Budget Week, where we saw, $13-ish billion a year in oil sands royalties, and then layer on another $5 billion a year. So that's sort of more than a quarter of the Alberta budget. So when you narrow it down to a little closer to home for us, it's just a massive, massive impact.
Yeah, and just to be clear, so the impact on the Alberta economy is clear. What does the federal government get in terms of its take?
Well, there's a couple of things. Directly, they're benefiting from the corporate taxes associated with the revenue from the oil and gas companies, insofar as they report in Canada and pay taxes in Canada. The larger oil sands companies will be a big share of that. And then you're also looking at all of, when we mentioned the jobs and the exports and everything associated with that, all of that personal income tax revenue flows in part to the federal, well, most of it flows to the federal government, and a large part of it is held by the federal government. You definitely have a big impact there on the Ottawa calculus as well. And then, there are some other impacts that maybe run the opposite direction. Of course, the greenhouse gas inventory, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but also effects on the Canadian dollar. The fact that oil and gas exports are such a big part of our economy, and that we rely on foreign direct investment. Both of those things tend to affect our exchange rate a little bit. And we're not talking about the Dutch disease anymore like we used to, but that plays into the macro side of the Canadian economy as well.
Yeah, Dutch disease. There's a whole roster of terms that have been associated with the oil sands that have been in vogue and out of vogue, but maybe we'll come back to that one in a bit. We are energy versus climate, so let's talk about the versus climate part. There's no free emissions lunch when it comes to producing a lot of oil. And as you said, it's a massive sector and it has a massive impact on the economy. What is the impact of the oil sands on Canada's overall GHG emissions?
I mean, oil and gas total, you're 189 right in the last available inventory. So probably today, if we carry those numbers forward, somewhere around 200 megatons out of 700 or 650 for the national economy. Emissions are so hard because our data are lagged a couple of years. So a lot of that production growth that you mentioned and the record levels we're at right now aren't in the new emissions data. And then you look closer to home, Alberta, 260 megatons-ish out of that national total. So, well better than a third of the national emissions here. And a lot of that coming from those large industrial facilities. So oil sands, the refining, the petrochem, that all runs from that oil and gas economy. So huge impact on our national emissions inventory.
Sure. And of course, every time you add a project or add production, then we get a commensurate increase in overall emissions. But talking about intensity, the oil sands had a big drop in emissions intensity per barrel produced years ago when some producers replaced burning petcoke with natural gas. But last time I looked at it, it had flatlined. That emissions intensity drop had flatlined. Has it stayed flat or has intensity dropped again? Frankly, I've not paid attention to it recently.
On the oil sand side, it's still coming down a little bit in the individual sectors, but the big changes that you have is more of our Canadian oil production is oil sands now. So you're sort of taking out the low emissions barrels and increasing the share of high emissions barrels. And then within the oil sands, we fluctuated a little bit between mining and in situ growth. So when we had two new big mines come in, Curl and Fort Hills, they're relatively low emissions intensity compared to other oil sand sources. Lately, we've had two big effects happening. One is, again, that growth coming back in the in situ side, which is a little higher emissions intensity. And some of the big legacy in situ projects, so well-based oil sands production, injecting steam into wells to produce bitumen. Some of those older sites are becoming dramatically more emissions intensive over time as they get older and as they're sort of cycling down the end of life of many wells, they get really emissions intensive. So it's a mixed story. We'll have another change coming up as Suncor. You mentioned the non-burning of petcoke. So Suncor has their new 800 megawatt cogeneration plant coming online that will take some emissions out of their plants by burning natural gas instead of petroleum coke. So it's changing all along, but there's no dramatic level shift. You listen to the headlines, it sounds like, wow, they've really driven this down over the last couple of years. Your summary of flat, really slow decline. There hasn't been a big level shift as those ones we had earlier on.
Yeah. And just noting when we talk about the future of the oil sands, it would be great to spend a bit of time, certainly in the in situ projects, how reservoir characteristics really dictate your overall carbon intensity. And perhaps we'll have a bearing on which projects thrive and which projects struggle. But growth, 3.5 million barrels per day seems like a lot, but that number is half of what we thought it might be back in the early 2010s based on growth trends and projects that were in application or announced by companies. I used to give presentations, included a graph of oil sands expansion plans. And back then, let's say, when I talked to your business class, operating was below 2 million barrels per day. Construction would bring it over to over 2 million. Approved was up to 4 million barrels per day. What had been in the application queue was 6 million barrels per day. What had been announced was 8. And I'd use that slide to show the staggering pace and scale of development and to talk about any intensity improvement being overwhelmed by absolute increases. But maybe you could tell us before we bring Sara and David in, how did we get to that 3.5 million barrels per day number from when I was talking to your class and it was under 2 in terms of economics and technology and policy factors, but also why is it only 3.5 million barrels per day and why did it not get up to 7 million barrels per day?
Yeah, I think there's a number of stories over time that have driven that. So the big changes that we saw in oil sands that allowed the growth. I mean, certainly the development of in-situ and steam-assisted gravity drainage technology, that's back 20 years now that we really saw those come online. But that ability to not have to build a giant mine site, number one, so much less capital intensive projects, shorter lifespan projects, and opened up a whole lot of the resource to production. So that was sort of the early 2000s to mid 2000s story. Then the next phase in the expansion that made things possible was all mines used to require an upgrader. You couldn't meet pipeline spec for heavy oil shipment out of an oil sands mine. So essentially, it was like a tied sell. Hey, you want an oil sands mine? You can produce some bitumen, but you can't ship it anywhere unless you build. So you got to build your own refinery up in Fort McMurray as well. And so that's a really big kind of add-on kicker to the investment. Newer mines, late 2010s into now, in particular, Curl, Fort Hills, some of the legacy Shell projects were able to get bitumen produced without that they could market directly without having an upgrader. So that made mining sort of, I would say, still feasible even as costs increased. And that cost increase would be the first of my answers to your question about why hasn't it grown as much as it might have. Cost inflation is the big reason. You go back and look a little bit before you would have spoken in my class, but we were talking about oil sands break evens at $8 to $12 a barrel for an upgraded project, and now we're talking about the costs of those projects went so high as to see you need $100-ish a barrel WTI to make some of these projects work. And that was, when oil recovered from the global financial crisis and there was a real push through the 2010s, that was really the story in Alberta, was everyone's trying to build an oil sands project and costs are going through the roof and we just can't contain this. Of course, the greenhouse gas emissions pressures, the pipeline wars, can you guarantee egress for your product out of Western Canada? Now, more recently, I think you see finance and insurance pressures and the uncertainty over global oil markets, that it's not just oil sands, that you look globally across the oil sector, that willingness to invest in a project that has its first oil 3 to 7 years from now, and then is going to produce for another 30 years beyond that, you're making a really big bet on the long-term oil market. And the US light tight oil gives you a great alternative to that. You can do something that pays itself off in 3 years. So your risk is much, much lower with some of the newer light tight oil, fracking, et cetera. And that's been driving the investment and the production growth, et cetera, in North America. And, that's had an impact on the value of our product as well. So I think a variety of factors pushing and pulling on both sides. I've got in front of me the CAPS 2014 forecast, 2013 and 14, that has a 7 million barrels a day of Canadian production. But I also pulled up there earlier, like 2011, and they're almost bang on to where we are in 2025. So you had all of these factors changing and all of this disruption and upset in the sector in various ways, and you end up basically at what we were forecasting in 2011.
Yeah. And you and I were joking the other day how different parties can take the same set of facts and spin them for their own purposes. And that growth, you had CAP trying back in the day to excite capital and labor and using an analogy like it's the size of Florida. Come on, everyone, there's room for you. And Greenpeace and others using that same comparator. It's the size of Florida. My gosh, they're going to undermine the whole thing. We need to stop it. So let's get straight to are the reports of the death of the oil sands greatly exaggerated question? And it is, what does a world using less oil, and that's, let's say it's going to use less oil, regardless of additional actions that nations take on climate, what does it mean for Canadian oil, but specifically the oil sands? And are those top executives right in saying that the oil sands is well positioned to keep producing during the global energy transition? And turning now, David or Sara, which of you wants to weigh in?
I'll jump in, kind of casting my mind back to when I was in Alberta and in the kind of the middle of this stuff more before the 2008 crash. I want to talk a little bit about, did people really expect it to get to 7 or 8 million barrels a day? That's certainly what the projections were. My sense of talking to people, my recollection of what I thought and others thought, is that felt unlikely. I think there were two things. One was this what I call the derivative constraint, that basically you're trying to build a lot of capital in a relatively small place, and the costs of labor and the cost of the supply chains to build things go up the faster you're building things. That's not the production rate, that's the build of new facilities rate. And I think there was an inherent constraint there, whereas you tried to build faster, prices went up, and so then prices of the construction went up, so you were less likely to build. And the other thing is, I think maybe that period kind of in the early 2000s was maybe the last ever of this real, I think, deeply naive and wrong-headed view that there was a kind of fundamental oil scarcity. You really heard people kind of thinking that the oil age would have to go to these unconventionals because there just wasn't enough conventional oil. And I think anybody who's thought hard about both the economic geology and the records since the 1850s should know that that's not the way the oil business has worked. And it feels even less likely to be true now, where there are clear climate-related forces that'll push us off oil. But I think that sense that there was kind of no alternative, that we had this giant reserve, was part of what drove that unrealism. But the flip side, I think, is my view is that climate did not play much role in what happened. That fundamentally the dynamics that got us to 3.5 were driven largely by oil market and not directly by climate.
Yeah. And will climate play a role in the oil sands going forward? I do remember, back then, and I get the name of the books, but there's actually a huge industry around promoting the feel of oil scarcity. And then some authors, who I shall remain nameless for this podcast, did a whole book on oil scarcity. What does it mean for the world? And then a few years later did Absolute Energy Abundance, a book on that. What does it mean for the world? Shamelessly. But Sara, what do you think?
I mean, two thoughts on sort of this, what the future looks like if I bring out my crystal ball. I think one is we have to be really careful about sort of what timelines we're talking about and what depth of change in the global oil markets we're thinking about, right? And I think sometimes we mix up what happens in the short term with what happens in the medium to long term. And so, short-term changes, I think there is a lot of credence to the idea that, many of these projects will be able to continue to produce at, somewhat lower oil prices. Profits will be lower, there'll be less, revenue and of all the ways that Andrew mentioned in the opening. But I think where we sometimes extend that short-term picture out too far is in arguments that I've heard that it doesn't matter if the heavy oil is more expensive than the light oil because that's what the refineries need, right? And so we're not competing against the broader light oil market. We're not competing against the Saudis. We're just competing against Venezuelan crude because that's, the refineries need that input slate. And I think that really misses the point that this is, as we talk about over and over, this is not changes around the edges. This is fundamentally a transition. And so once you get into that transition phase, then you start opening up, well, okay, if we're actually going to be using much less oil in the world, then we're going to have some major changes to our set of refineries. And, in particular, if what we already, I think, I would argue, are very much in the midst of, and it's hard to see how it doesn't happen. If we see demand for gasoline dropping while other oil products are still remaining relatively higher, well, what does that mean? That means refineries actually have to make some pretty major adjustments to start to adjust the output slate of their products. And not being a chemical engineer, but having lots of great chemical engineer friends at the University of Calgary, like Joel Bergeson, I've learned that, once they get to that point, they can also make adjustments to the input slate. There's no fundamental reason that heavy oil needs to be part of the mix of what refineries are taking. It just has been because that's, sort of what was around when they designed them. And so once you get into this point where you say, well, now I'm going to have to make some pretty major investments in my refineries to produce the right kind of output slate, it's a very natural time to look around the world and go, well, what would be a good input slate to define for? Where can I, get cheap, low carbon oil? And I think that is the moment where Canadian oil sands start to become really challenged, because you are no longer just competing against that specific heavy crude, but you actually do have to compete directly with these sources that are either, large and cheap to get out of the ground, if we think about, places like Saudi, or to the point that was made earlier, against things like shale oil, where, you can have these much shorter timeframes. And so it makes more sense as an investment point.
I hope you didn't take my statements to mean that the climate won't have an impact in the future. I think
no, not at all. Yeah.
And I really agree with you. This business of shifting market, that as electric vehicles really move, the demand for gasoline will go down, but the demand for aviation kerosene and residuals will go down more slowly, or will go up for quite a while still. I think that is an important shakeup. But I think that many people really underestimated the extent to which battery electric vehicles would go quickly. This idea that just in the last few years we've innovated pretty fast away from needing cobalt, for example, as much as we did. And the press is filled with reports of how electric vehicle sales are slowing a little bit. I, as somebody who was quite skeptical it would go this fast, am now really quite optimistic that electric vehicles are going to go. To be clear, it'll be an S curve, and I think there's going to be some use of oil products in even light-duty transportation for a long, long time. But I think the middle part of that S curve is really going to go. And the big point is, with the global oil markets, you don't have to pull demand down much. And remember, it's both this and also demographic transitions as fertility rates go down and population flattens. You don't have to bring demand down much to really have prices get lower. And then that really makes it tough for oil sands.
I also find it interesting, this pace of development. Andrew just went through this whole story of what is arguably an amazingly fast pace of development, where we went from, basically inventing SAGD and proving it out that it worked at all, to massive growth over, a period of just a couple decades. And the idea that we somehow then, though, still believe that that's not going to be possible in other resources from the ground. So, I think taking some lessons from the history of the pace of the development of the oil sands really shows us how quickly things can change.
Yeah, I remember a story I've told on EBC in the past, is a task force on oil sands in the mid-90s, provincially appointed, set a big, hairy, audacious target for oil sands production and thought maybe we'll get up to 1 million barrels of production a day by 2020. Well, the oil sands actually hit that in 2004. And one could argue that environmental management systems have been playing catch up ever since. And actually, just a plug. So our next show is with Climate Brief's Simon Evans, and we're going to unpack this rash of information on EVs that's been coming out of late, and a lot of it bad. And why is it coming out now? But you wrote in your book, Andrew, global action on climate will mean less demand for oil and gas, but that does not necessarily imply lower prices, nor that the value of Canada's oil and gas production will be compromised. And you make the point that oil and gas consumption and prices do not necessarily move in the same direction. Can you expand upon that?
Yeah, I think, well, David kind of got to it in his comments to say, fundamentally, what we care about is the price of oil, right? And that sounds trite, but we tend to forget about that. And we tend to also see people make an immediate jump from, well, hey, if global demand drops some amount or is lower growth than expectations, that automatically translates to dramatically lower prices. And it only does so if people aren't expecting it to happen. And, go back to, for, an Alberta audience, right? 2015, 16, 17 was a pretty awful time because oil prices collapsed from, the hundreds of dollars per $110, $120 a barrel down into the high 20s. And they did that in an environment where oil demand was growing, but it was just that production was growing more quickly than consumption. So this immediate math, right? Well, you're an economist, we know which way the curve slopes. Well, there's two curves on that graph, right? There's a demand curve and a supply curve. And the question is, how does supply respond? So David's absolutely right on that, the world oil market is very sensitive, but it's sensitive to both. So world oil investment right now is not actually matching what, so the rhetoric about demand growth, right? The oil companies are not putting their money where their sort of forecasts are, but they're also putting more money into the system right now than, an IEA style net zero or even near net zero scenario. They're investing way more in oil and gas production than would be associated generally with those scenarios. So we're somewhere in the middle where we're, depending on how aggressive policies get and how close people get to meeting those goals in the near term, you could have either outcome. You could have a relatively high oil price world with declining demand and declining production. Don't think that's particularly the most likely, but it's there as a plausible scenario. You could also have a world where everybody keeps betting on, we're going to keep using oil, we're going to be, the last barrel standing, and everyone thinks they're going to be the last barrel standing, and we end up with a market that's, 2015 style over 2016 style oversupplied dramatically with oil.
In principle, you can have declining supply and prices could be either way. I do think there's kind of this dynamic that at both country and business level about who gets to extract those last rents. And I think there's a way in which some places that are sitting on oil that's pretty cheap to produce and has limited quantity are going to want to extract those oil rents hard. I'm looking at you, Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, I have a paper on this from way back when on with the sort of uninformative title of Would Hoteling Kill the Electric Car? But thinking of how, traditional economic models of resource extraction, what happens in a world where you suddenly think, wow, the alternatives are going to get dramatically better in a really rapid manner. And essentially, there's one outcome where it's, we call it the make hay while the sun shines strategy, to say there's 20 years left in this resource, I might as well do it now. And the other one is just, okay, there's 20 years left to make rents. How do I make rents? I pull back on production. And so the Saudis decide, you know what, I'd rather produce less at $150 a barrel than flood the market and try to live on 30. And that math is not clear. It could go either way.
So you talked about the bets that the oil and gas industry is making globally, but what bets are they making in the oil sands specifically and the banks that stand behind them? I think it's been 6 years since an oil sands project has achieved FID.
Yeah, certainly we're still seeing very limited new project investment. That doesn't mean, limited capital investment. We're seeing some of that rebound, but it's nowhere near where it was in the heyday of 2013, 14, et cetera. We're still well below that peak in terms of people putting money into new production and new projects. You're seeing Cenovus, for example, I think they just announced yesterday, 25,000 barrels a day incremental at Foster Creek and 30,000 at Christina Lake, or the reverse of that, or vice versa. But so you're seeing a lot of those, what would historically have been a new big project that's just incremental at existing projects. So there's some of that. But since really 2016, you've seen a couple of things. You've seen companies pull back. You've seen a big consolidation. So Shell pulled out. Canadian Natural now owns probably 3x the oil sands resource that it did when you were on the stage with Murray Edwards in 2015 at Notley's climate announcement. So they're much more. So they bought essentially cheap existing resource. Suncor's bought out a whole bunch of their partners in different projects. They've bought resource. The existing players are flush with existing projects that have expansion opportunities. So there is still capital flowing in. It's nowhere near what it was in 2014. And most of it is just flowing to the existing projects and expanding production in those existing projects.
Yeah. And I get the sense that oil sands observers, unless you're a close observer, you haven't seen that degree of consolidation. And it's astounding when you look at the cost of production and, capital costs being entirely paid off of the existing producers, that they can continue to operate, find efficiencies, and produce a very cheap barrel of oil.
Whether you look at profits or costs, right? You see the royalties included, operating costs included, et cetera. That sort of operating profit number, these facilities are making in some cases $40 or $50 a barrel, pre-tax operating profit right now. So they're cash generating machines at this point.
Yeah, it really is important to say that, as much as I think this is socially really bad for Alberta to be so oil dependent, and I've worked on climate my whole life. I think it's terrible. You got to say the innovation, the business and technical innovation has just been stunning to be able to really make that much money and drive down operating costs this far. It's extremely impressive.
Of course, there's also the ability to offload some of those costs potentially onto future Albertans and Canadians as a whole when we talk about things like liabilities. I don't think the oil industry is unique in this. I think this is common across extractive industries, right? We see this happening in the coal sector in the US, where it feels like every day there's another story about, how this unfunded liability is actually worse than anybody thought. But I think that also, should be considered in the mix in terms of, and I think it was, Andrew, I think you wrote that paper with some colleagues at UFC that focus on the idea that out of probably conservative estimate of 46 billion of outstanding closure liabilities in the oil sands, there's something like 1 billion that's actually been put down in securities too. So we're there's a bit of borrowing from the future of who's actually going to be around to clean that up.
Yeah, and I mean, what's amazing, right, is when you see how lucrative these facilities are. there is still a disconnect if you're not close to it. The idea that these things are just like a sneeze away from shutting down, packing things up and going away. And so we can't do anything, we can't change the rules. We can't, require reclamation. We can't do that because the investment will go in. And so you got to pick a lane here. These are incredibly lucrative cash generating machines that are the foundation of our, national economy and our export sector, or they're a marginal, very barely profitable industry that could go away tomorrow, and sort of, pick one side of that. You can't have both.
And part of that is, with a big hand extended out toward the federal government, asking for, massive help in building out CCS technology in the oil sands. But before we go there, let's talk a little bit about government's perspectives on the growth of the oil sands. And let's start with Alberta, because it's topical. We just recently, last week, had the Alberta government released its latest budget, and it did two things. The budget doubles down on royalties and its contribution to Alberta coffers and its prospects or its confidence in the growth of oil, as Premier Smith has been very clear and open about for forever. But it's also the government of Alberta is dropping money into its heritage fund in a way that a bunch of recent previous governments haven't. And almost like it's hedging and signaling that perhaps there could be a transition, and this will actually have serious implications for the government of Alberta and its budget. Andrew, what is your thought?
Well, that's another place where it's sort of a pick a lane story, right? Where if you look at the budget, we threw some money into the Heritage Fund based on last year's sort of unspent dollars, which is kind of the reality of the Heritage Fund for most of the last 20 years. When we suddenly have an influx of royalties so large and so unexpected that we don't know what to do with it, we end up contributing to the Heritage Fund. But given a little bit of time, we can find ways to spend it, which is kind of, despite the Premier's address to the province on television, that's kind of what you see in the budget. There isn't as much going into the Heritage Fund over the balance of the budget as there is going in this year. And so now we're in all of a sudden a situation where if the Premier on one hand saying, get off the resource roller coaster, on the other hand, we've now basically set our provincial budget up to depend on $16 or $17 billion a year in resource royalties.
This barrels a day per person, to me, is a good way to illustrate how really unusual Alberta is in the rich world and how kind of frighteningly oil dependent it is. Many listeners will have heard of Texas and think of it as being a pretty big oil producer, but it's actually a little less than Alberta in production of 3.6 million barrels a day and 27 million people. Norway, which was a million barrel a day per person, is now 2 million barrels a day and over 5 million people. So Alberta is really a very unusually oil dependent place. And I think it's just hard to understand how central it is to the politics and how hard it is to imagine change, sadly.
Yeah. And just how much we've internalized that into the way we think about, the way we mythologize Alberta, right? It's the Alberta advantage. This has all happened solely because we had slightly lower corporate income taxes than the rest of the country. Not, of course, because there's like 1 trillion barrels of oil buried under our province and not buried under others, but for these few small changes, this thing never would have happened. But, you talked about savings and all of this. I often think about it like Norway has been a point of frustration for me for a long time. That people look at Alberta and say, why aren't we like Norway? And so, well, fundamentally, our oil industry has never since the 70s been like Norway's. We've always had, as you said in the opener, this idea that 10 years from now, we're going to be producing twice as much oil and it's going to be twice as valuable. And so, I liken it even now to saying, like, I walk into my undergrad class and say, you know what, you guys should really be putting some money aside, because in like 10 years from now, you're going to be raking it in and you're going to wish you'd have saved more money today when you were a student. It makes no sense. And so if you're the Premier of Alberta and you're saying, the world's always going to use oil, there's going to be huge demand for oil, we're going to double our oil production, and we should really sock some money aside for that future right now, that doesn't make any sense. Norway did it because they thought they had 15 years of oil. Lougheed did it because he thought we had 15 years of oil. If you were in the space of we have 20 years of oil left, then yeah, you might want to start, not spending 17 billion a year in royalties, but maybe saving it and smooth things out a bit. But that's not consistent with the world's always going to use more oil every year forever, and they're going to pay more for it, and we're going to produce double what we do now. That's not a proposition for saving today.
And this is where the political moment is so pivotal, because Not that there's some perfect kumbaya climate policy globally, but it really does feel like the world is going to move to restrict carbon emissions. I'm really quite confident about that. And electric vehicles are happening. And so that outlook just feels different, however much you think about particular projections.
I mean, I obviously can't go back into history. I don't have a time machine yet. David, you could make one for me potentially. When you get this direct air capture thing sorted out.
Just turned 60, need to do that.
If you went back to the Jevons era and thinking about oil taking over from coal, and at that point, it must have looked like, Jevons said, "Oh no, oil is a poor substitute for coal." Is naysayer on it. You go a little further forward, it's like, wow, the world is not going to be using a lot of coal for very long into the future because we have oil, we got natural gas, we got this massive change in, and lo and behold, it still turns out that, for 100 years, we use essentially uninterrupted coal year over year over year. And so, I think you're absolutely right. The electric vehicle changes the landscape tremendously, but what does it do to the rest of the energy system? I still think you need that climate coordination to say, we want the emissions out of the system. And that's your the combustion side of that barrel of oil that is, 80% of the world's oil use today is combustion in one way or another. And are we going to get away from that? Or are we just going to do, more cheap air travel and, less combustion driven personal transportation?
And Sara, let's talk about the federal government's efforts to get the emissions out of the system, because it's come out with great fanfare, but also great criticism coming from Alberta. The federal cap on oil and gas emissions. Andrew and I will remember the Alberta Climate Leadership Days and the difficult conversations, but ultimately successful, around the Oilsands emissions cap, which was designed, never regulated, never enforced. But I still think it's a good idea. And not on a podcast, I can tell stories about how we came up with the 100 megaton number, and we being the environmental groups and companies working quietly together. But Sara, you've written just recently, I think you just published it yesterday, an op-ed with Martin Olszynski talking about the impact of the federal oil and gas emissions cap. What kind of bet is the federal government making with regards to the oil sands, with, on one hand, handing out lots of money or setting aside lots of money for an investment tax credit for CCS, but on the other hand, moving on a cap that, while not perfect, will still, really have a strong bearing on the oil sands and growth?
Yeah, that was an unintentionally, but turned out well-timed with our episode op-ed in the Globe with Martin Olszynski. And really, we're sort of making a point similar to Andrew, you said earlier, you can't have it both ways. And I think that's sort of the central point of the op-ed, which is to say, so the federal government, for those who aren't aware, has proposed a cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector as a whole. And they break down sort of how they got to that cap by sector type. And so they have a sort of effective cap on emissions from the oil sands of a reduction of 20 megatons from a baseline level by a baseline 2030 level, so out to 2030. And, this cap was announced, and there was, sort of endless comments made about how this is, totally unfair. And I think there's room for debate about, the policy, and I've had interesting conversations with Trevor Toom about, whether it makes sense or not. But what we really wanted to focus on was this central point, which is, you've heard from industry and its surrogates that this cap is effectively a production cap. Basically, we can't, continue to do and to produce the oil sands while meeting this emissions reductions. And so what we point out in the op-ed is that this cap, this reduction of 20 megatons, is actually slightly less ambitious than what the Pathways Industry Alliance has said that they intend to do, which is 22 megatons by 2030. And so, you have sort of, on the one hand, industry through Pathways going around, repeating this idea that this is what the industry is committing to do. They, as recently as earlier 2023, they said that this was an ambitious but achievable cap. They talked about it a lot at COP as a big part of the solution. And yet back here in Canada, they say, we can't do this. And so the question is, which is it? Again, to use Andrew's phrase, you've got to pick a lane. And I think that really brings a reason and where regulations become important, because we've seen already when it comes to liability, say in the conventional oil and gas sector, a lot of promises being made about plans and then them not coming through. And so I think what's interesting about what the federal government has done with this cap, different from, say, the clean electricity regulations, where they're sort of pushing more than industry says that they want to go. Here, they've really set something up that is even slightly less ambitious. And so it's a little bit, in my mind, it's really a test of like, are you serious? Pathways, are you really ready to put your money where your mouth is, that this is what you're going to do? Or is this just a PR stunt? And it's very hard to sort of know which is the case until we get to 2030, other than that if you actually regulate the cap, then, they're basically really promising to do it, not just, saying that they're going to do it. And so I'm still sort of waiting. I mean, Pathways themselves, I think it was in December, said that, we're studying the cap to understand it. And I don't think that they've made a public comment on it since then. But I think it is a moment to really say, is there a seriousness about what industry says that they're going to do under the Pathways Alliance? Or is that, not something they're ready to commit to? And so I find that to be a very helpful legislation that really forces that conversation to today. And frankly, I think also, would really force, if I was an oil sands CEO, I think you have a really hard time explaining to your investors why you would invest in CCS unless you were forced to do so.
Yeah. And why would shareholders make that investment? They would make the investment if you've got a government of Canada basically writing a check for the lion's share of the costs. Or if you really thought that the world was seriously going to get really serious on climate change and you think your technology pathways will, help you avert this existential crisis. And talking about that necessarily begs the question of CCS or CCUS. And to pull back the curtain for the audience, David had said when we were planning out the show that let's keep the conversation on CCS and the oil sands brief. And now I turn to you, David, as to why you think it's a quick discussion.
I just don't see any sensible prospect of oil sands CCS. And just for full disclosure, I was the only non-CEO, as I recall, on this big federal panel of 5 people or so that recommended some of the original money and stuff for this decade and a half ago. I think there are 2 kinds of reasons why I think it's implausible. One is it turns out that the oil sands are actually kind of far away from good reservoirs and expensive places to do things, and just overall not a great place for CCS, not impossible, but not great. And 2, there's this basic fact that it's not clear it makes sense to scrub the CO2 from that basically declining resource. So Ed, I think you just said, maybe I didn't get quite this right, or it would happen in a world where suddenly we see climate as an existential crisis and we have to act fast. But I think the point is, in that world, which I don't think we're quite in, I wish we were a little more in, I do think we do CCS on some things, but not on the oil sands. Because in a world where we're really acting fast on climate, what we're doing at the oil sands is just gradually closing them down. We'll do CCS on other things like cement plants, where we're going to keep needing cement and we need a way to do it. Or maybe natural gas electricity, where we need a way to manage intermittency, or some other steel, for example. So I think there's places where CCS has a sensible role in a rapidly decarbonizing economy, but I don't think oil sands is it.
Let's actually bring in some audience questions. So I'm going to start, and where is Paul Lapense's question? Also pulling back the curtain. In the same way that we overpredicted oil sands development in the early 2010s, even in the clear face of pipeline and upgrader limitations and of competition from fracking, are we currently equally overpredicting the pace of electrification in the clear face of limitations in green electricity production, transmission, and recharging infrastructure networks, as well as the huge extraction and refining requirement of key minerals?
I would say yes. I think it's always very interesting to have conversations with people in the oil and gas sector where they assert very strongly that there's no way that we can get more of these minerals and metals out of the ground, while, having themselves been part of an industry that, has made really incredible progress in what they're able to produce out of the ground. And so there seems to be this disconnect between the two. I think the other piece that we risk underestimating the pace of change on is also how much more efficient we can become with some of these metals and minerals as our technologies improve. So David mentioned the point of, engineering the need for cobalt out of the batteries. I mean, certainly we are going to need certain metals and minerals, but there is more sort of shiftability and replaceability than maybe we always appreciate. And then overall, part of the way that we bring costs down of technologies as we produce more of them, part of that is actually that we get more efficient and we need less of the inputs to make those products as well too. So I think there's a lot of ways where we sort of miss those points.
We tend to approach any new resource or any new development as how can we do this while not changing anything else about how can we make this new thing look exactly like the thing I have right now? And, in that piece, David, I think you pick on why on earth are we worried about how can we store electricity to run a desalination plant 24/7, 365? Why aren't we thinking about how cheap it is to store water? And I think there are a lot of thought processes like that are still to come on the electricity side, right? And you saw even a hint of that with our blackout in Alberta, or near blackouts in Alberta a while ago, where the government's saying, hey, stop doing all these things, like stop, charging your electric vehicle. But 10 years from now, the call won't be stop charging your electric vehicle. It'll be please discharge your electric vehicle. Of course, it won't be done by a message to your cell phone. It'll just be done on an automated basis. And, we need to get people to that point. I think we are probably overestimating some things, but I think we're also really underestimating what we'll be able to do with some of the technological changes that are coming our way that that we're not even internalizing into how we integrate this electrified world into our lives.
I think you're right, but it's a great question because it's basically saying, how do you guys know what you know? And I think the answer is we don't. And of course, it's possible we're wrong. I say, and I type this in the answer, I think if you'd asked me 4 or 5 years ago, I would have focused more on this supply chain for batteries, both the battery manufacturer and the mineral supply chain. I don't see that as a likely bottleneck now for the reason Sara gave. But I can easily imagine that there's a real bottleneck in just developed countries just being slow for all sorts of reasons of government dysfunction and NIMBYism and the fact that it's actually difficult to get electric power systems able to handle it. So, yeah, I agree with Andrew that in principle, we should use electric vehicles, reverse charging to manage grid instability. But I've been hearing that for a long time. It's not actually easy to do. Not that it's technically so hard, but it's hard in a regulatory and social sense. So there could be ways in which we just can't reform grids and get stuff built in developed world fast enough to do that. I can easily imagine that being a limit.
Got a productivity question here from Mac Van Wiedeligen, who many people know from ARC Resources and ARC Financial. He says, and this one's for you, Andrew, many experts argue that Canada is in a form of a long-term productivity crisis. Based on stats, non-conventional oil is $1,000 per hour compared to all industries being roughly $60 per hour on a productivity level. Perhaps this is another perspective on what Andrew said, that the oil sands sector has had a massive economic impact. When we gradually, in quotation, Mac, when we gradually close down the oil sands, end quote, we are gradually closing down the highest value creator in Canada. Comments?
Yeah, I think that's partly exactly the right way to have the conversation. So don't forget that the oil in the ground has huge value. And I know Mac's not going to forget that. His business is tied to it. But, you can't just kind of say, well, compare somebody producing another good or service from scratch versus somebody extracting oil and fail to value the oil in that equation. It's important. But that's a piece I pick up on my book when I talk about the just transition policies, or the transition away from oil, and even how we talk about moving away from oil and gas in Canada, as though, we can sort of offhand this, oh yeah, well, we'll just shut it down. And, we'll just find these workers new jobs and we'll just work this out. And I'm going to draw on one example I use in the book, which is the Newfoundland cod fishery compared to the oil and gas sector in Canada, which is, when the Newfoundland cod fishery shut down, of course, it was a regional calamity and, had some national spillovers. But if you look at where the wages were and where the government income situation was and where the draw on government money was, this was a sector that was quite heavily subsidized, labor that was quite heavily subsidized, workers that made far below the provincial and national average, as opposed to oil and gas, where you're looking at workers that are currently making 2 to 3x the national average in depending on which part of the sector they're in. And it's a sector that produces massive, not just revenue for people, but revenue for government. So when we offhand, oh yeah, Mac put in quotes, oh yeah, we'll just, gradually close this down. That's a very different decision than we've made about coal power, than we've made about cod, than we've made about asbestos, than we've made about any of these other things where we sort of had these similar conversations, and it's on a much larger scale.
I'm really glad this conversation came up. I am just personally really worried for the future of the country and of Alberta and my friends in Alberta. I think that this underlying reality, and it was great to see these actual productivity numbers, $1,000 an hour productivity compared to 60. These are huge. So as much as we have to transition away from oil, it is going to be really painful. And I think the thing that I most worry about, I'm even panicked about, is the sense that people in the Alberta and Canadian governments just are blind to that reality. They're just not thinking seriously about the challenge they face. And you can't govern well if you're blinding yourself to reality.
Two thoughts on that. So one is, gradually closing down the oil sands. Part of that is it a choice or is it a response to global markets, right? So how much is it something that we're choosing to do versus something that we have to respond to? And I think we've talked about that already earlier, but I'll flag that. Then I think the other point to me around the productivity is like, so what do you do if you do see a future where there is external pressure such that we have less demand for oil here? What is the best use of the public funds that come from the oil sector in the meantime? I share David's concerns, but I also think that it's not too late in that I think we are going to have, at least a decade probably of a lot of volatility in oil prices, and there will still be money coming into public coffers that stuff can be done with that. And that's where then I really question, the business case or the wiseness of the public investing that in decarbonizing the oil sands versus other things that we could be doing with that we know are needed to sort of build up and make an economy more productive. And that goes back to, investing in our infrastructure, in our broader infrastructure, investing in education and in kind of all of these systems that support sort of development of new economic opportunities. And we look often at longingly, I guess, at the U.S. at their sort of productivity levels, and we are not doing the same things, and we're not sort of investing in innovation in the same sort of open way that the U.S. is, versus having it more tied to sort of the industries that we have today. So I think that I definitely take the point, and I agree that it is going to be a challenge. I think it's not something that we really can completely control within Canada. I think we can't, for all the reasons that we've talked about, just decide, well, let's not close down the oil sands and let's just keep them, running at this level of productivity for the next 40 years. But it should give us, really then very careful consideration of what's the best way to prepare for that. And I take Andrew's point that, and you should read the book where he goes into it in more detail about, it's not that we can as a government or any government could really sort of plan out that future and really smoothly make it all happen. But governments can do things like making investments in infrastructure and infrastructure writ large, including, education, all these pieces that really create the ingredients that are necessary to have productivity growth within an economy.
Yeah, if you're a policymaker in Canada, you could make a valid argument to say, listen, and this is what we're trying to do with EVC, is have these honest conversations around trade-offs between economic outputs and climate. Say, all right, well, climate's going to suffer. And what we're going to do is let these operations operate as they will, and know that there will be a time where global market forces, Canadian policy will have actually really a smaller effect, will dictate whether they're around or not. But in the meantime, we're going to capture as much wealth as possible. And Andrew, I think, to give another shout out to your book, I think you use the analogy of, if you're a policymaker in 2030 and the oil sands continues because oil supply is tight, prices are high, it's kicking off jobs, it's kicking off taxes and royalties. That's really then difficult to go in and say, all right, we're gradually now going to let the air out of that balloon. And it's not like, as you say, the cod fishery. It's not like coal, because, as you said right up the top, the number of jobs that, unfortunately, I'll take that back. The number of jobs that the sector produces is astounding. It's a huge number. And I say only unfortunately, because then if you're talking about transition to policymaker, you're affecting such a huge part of the Canadian population and output. It makes it very, very challenging.
Yeah, one of the sagas I tried to look at in there was how we dealt with asbestos, right? And you think about, like, as we were mining asbestos in Quebec, a lot of local jobs, local impact, et cetera. It wasn't a national scope and scale, really. But, even up to the point where the world had identified asbestos as all the terrible things that it does, we were still, at least from Ottawa, trying to provide loans to get the Jeffrey mine started back up in Quebec, right? We were that desperate for that economic development in that particular region. And then to flip that conversation on its head and think about, to some degree, how we talk about, and to David's point, like how we talk about real people in Alberta, right? These are not abstract numbers in a spreadsheet. This is like a person to whom I'm saying, nice job you had there, but sorry. And it's easy to do in some ways if that industry is non-viable, if there's an easy alternative, if there's a better job down the road with higher pay. It's much, much harder to do when the global market is saying, please give me this stuff. And we're willing to pay a lot for it. And you're trying to tell someone to take a worse job so that we can avoid meeting that global demand.
Big thank you, Andrew, for joining us on the show. It was great to have you and your extensive knowledge and experience with the oil sands sector.
That was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Amit Tandon, with help from Crystal Hickey, Serena Gibson, and Talia Grinnell. Our title and show music is The Wind Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with support from the University of Calgary's Office of the Vice President Research and the university's Global Research Initiative. Further support comes from the Trache Family Foundation, the North Family Foundation, and our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners to find the show. We'll be back in late March with a show looking at fact versus myth when it comes to electric vehicles, with special guest Dr. Simon Evans of Carbon Brief. See you then.